They called my mother's recipe box old garbage, said it with that brisk, bright tone of a woman who believes she's doing the world a favor by clearing it of sentiment, dust, and anything that doesn't match her curated beige and chrome vision of a proper home. I heard the words before I saw the flames, and for a moment I thought I'd misheard, that surely no one would throw something like that into a fire, not the wooden box my mother polished with her own hands, not the one that held the handwriting I used to trace when I was young and lonely and needed to remember where I came from. But the smell of burning varnish arrived before the denial left my mouth, and then I saw it. My daughter-in-law standing by the fireplace, her manicured fingers dusting off her palms as if she had just completed a meaningful task, as if disposing of what belonged to me was some noble deed for the household. I was still holding the dish towel I'd used to wipe my hands after slicing fruit for the children, and I remember staring at it stupidly, as though I could somehow wipe away what was happening in front of me, as though domestic routines had any power against people who think they own the right to redefine your existence. I'm 78, and I live alone now, in a small house with a slanted porch and peeling paint that curls like old petals. I'm not embarrassed by it. The drafts in winter and the creaky boards have more honesty in them than the expensive silence of my son's home ever did. But back then, in that kitchen full of spotless surfaces and appliances that made more noise than the people who lived with them, I still believed I belonged to that family. Still believed I was allowed to keep the few things that tethered me to the world before I became someone's mother, before I became someone's burden. I remember the exact angle of the sunlight coming through the tall windows, the way it glinted on the stainless steel counters, the way it caught the gold threads in my daughter-in-law's sweater. She didn't look at me when she tossed the box in. She looked at the hearth as if supervising a burn she'd scheduled. I heard the recipes shifting inside, heard the faint crackle of old paper curling, and something inside me folded so sharply I thought it might cut through my ribs. She said, "We don't need clutter, Martha. I'm streamlining the kitchen, modernizing." Modernizing, that's what she called burning my mother's handwriting. My mother, who never owned anything modern, who kept her recipes on scraps of grocery bags and old envelopes because she couldn't justify buying a proper notebook. My mother, who taught me to cook by scent rather than measure because we never had measuring cups, who pressed that recipe box into my hands when I was 24 and terrified and pregnant with the boy who now stood between me and the fireplace, murmuring, "Mom, let it go. It's not a big deal." Oh, but it was. It was the last thread tying me to a woman who stitched her love into the food she made when she had nothing else to give. I didn't shout. That's not my way. I'm not a woman who makes scenes, though I suppose I should have learned how to, because silence is a language ungrateful people love to exploit. I simply stood there with my hand on the counter, steadying myself as the smoke spiraled upward and the air filled with the scent of burning glue and cinnamon, and something that felt like betrayal. Baked too long in an oven, no one bothered to check. My daughter-in-law went back to arranging lemons in a white ceramic bowl, her movements crisp and practiced, as though she had checked off a necessary task on her list. My son put an arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him with the satisfaction of a woman who believes she has won something, though she would never say that aloud, not in front of the children, not in front of the woman who used to rock her son to sleep when he was colicky and feverish and impossible. I took a breath, or tried to, but the smoke felt thick in my throat. I told myself it was only the fire. I told myself I was being dramatic. That's what happens when you've been trained for years to minimize your own injuries. You explain your pain to yourself until it stops sounding like pain at all. But even then, even while I stood there pretending everything was normal, I felt something familiar rise in me. Something like a memory of my mother's voice, soft but stern, the way she spoke when she wanted me to pay attention. "Things matter because people matter," she once said to me as she folded dough on our chipped wooden table. When someone doesn't care about what matters to you, they don't really care about you. At the time, I thought she was talking about men, about the suitors who came and went in our tiny town. I didn't realize she was also warning me about the future I would build with my own hands and then hand over to people who would hold it carelessly. I should tell you who I was in that moment, not just the stunned woman watching a fire, but the woman behind the quiet. I had moved in with my son temporarily, or at least that was the plan. Or rather, the plan they presented to me with cheerful voices and a spreadsheet of helpful options. They said it would be easier for everyone. They said it would give me company, structure, routine. They said the stairs in my old place were unsafe, and maybe they were right about that last part. But safety is a poor substitute for dignity. Still, I had agreed, telling myself it was only for a few months, that I could adapt, that I could be useful, that I could be wanted. I arrived with one suitcase, one bag of clothes, and one wooden box wrapped in a towel so it wouldn't get scratched. That box was the only object I carried from house to house every time life demanded I uproot myself. It survived a move across the country, a house fire in 1978, 3 basements with moldy shelves, and the clumsy hands of grandchildren who used it as a drum when they were toddlers. And yet it did not survive an afternoon with a woman who thought sentimentality was a sign of weakness. I suppose the part that haunts me most is not the fire, nor the dismissive tone, nor the way my son looked away when I asked him why they didn't consult me first. No, what haunts me is the certainty with which they assumed I had no right to my own past, as though history belonged only to the living, not to the ones who carried it forward. They dismissed the box because they dismissed me, not in words, because people like them don't use words for that, but in small acts that accumulate until your presence becomes an inconvenience, until your memories are seen as clutter, until your identity becomes negotiable. When the flames died down and only a soft bed of ash remained, I stepped closer, ignoring the heat, ignoring the voices behind me, telling me to be careful. A part of me wanted to reach into the embers and pull out anything that might have survived. One corner of a card, one scrap of my mother's handwriting. But I didn't. I knew ashes when I saw them. I knew finality when it warmed my face like that. I walked out through the back door into the yard, the cool air hitting me with the kind of gentleness I hadn't felt inside the house for months. And I stood there, gripping the railing as though it were a lifeline. My son called after me, saying something about dinner plans, about keeping things light for the kids, about how I shouldn't read into things. But I had already read enough to fill a book. That was the day I realized, though I wouldn't admit it aloud for weeks, that something had shifted permanently. It wasn't about the box anymore. It wasn't even about my mother or her recipes. It was about the quiet truth rising inside me like a tide I could no longer ignore. I was not loved there. I was tolerated when convenient, dismissed when inconvenient, and shaped into whatever version suited them best. Harmless, quiet, grateful, obedient. But I have lived too many years and buried too many dreams to be obedient. I stood in the yard with the breeze lifting the edges of my sleeves and made a promise to myself. No one would burn my past again. Not literally, not metaphorically, not in any way that left me holding smoke instead of roots. I didn't know then what I would do or where I would go. or that the fire had failed to destroy the one thing they never knew existed. I didn't yet know that beneath the charred remains of that wooden box, beneath the paper and the splinters and the soot, something had survived. Something small, metal, and stubborn, like me. A key. A key they never saw because they never bothered to look. A key my mother taped to the bottom of the box the year she died. For later, she had whispered. I didn't understand it then. But later had finally come. The moment the embers cooled into a dull, sullen gray, something inside me cracked with a sound I swear was louder than the fire itself, though no one else seemed to notice. My son and his wife moved around the kitchen with the easy choreography of people who believe they have just accomplished something practical and necessary. Tidying up the hearth, adjusting throw pillows, wiping the countertop as if this were any other Saturday afternoon. They spoke softly about errands and grocery lists and an upcoming parent-teacher meeting, their voices floating through the room like light steam rising from a kettle. And I stood there in the doorway, feeling like a stranger in a home I had partially paid for. A ghost quietly watching the living rearrange their comfortable world without any consideration of the history they had just destroyed. I didn't cry, though I felt the sting rise behind my eyes like smoke, desperate for release. Instead, I simply placed one hand on the cool edge of the marble counter and steadied myself, because I understood, with a clarity I had never allowed myself before, that what had happened wasn't a careless act, wasn't an accident of the moment, or a misunderstanding born of generational difference. It was a decision, a deliberate and calculated erasure disguised as housekeeping, a choice made by people who had grown too comfortable deciding what parts of me were worth keeping. When the children wandered into the room asking about snacks, my daughter-in-law cheerfully handed them pre-portioned fruit cups and shooed them outside to the patio, her smile polished and bright as though nothing unusual had transpired. My son checked his phone, glanced at the time, and asked me whether I wanted to join them later for a walk as if offering charity. I watched him for a long moment, searching his face for the boy who used to sit at my kitchen table licking batter off the wooden spoon and begging for stories about my mother. The boy who once cried when I forgot to place a note in his lunchbox. The boy who asked me to save those recipe cards because he wanted them someday. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man who now followed the rhythm of another household. A man who let his wife throw my mother's handwriting into a fire and then soothed me with platitudes that tasted like ash. "Mom, please don't make this a bigger deal than it is," he said, when I didn't respond immediately. And the soft plea in his voice cut me deeper than any harsh word could, because it carried the unmistakable message that my grief was an inconvenience, that my attachment to my past was an obstacle to the smooth running of their present. I wanted to scream, to tell him that he had no idea what he had allowed to be destroyed, that the box wasn't just a container, but a life stitched together over decades, a chronicle of flavors and stories and memories that had survived wars, relocations, heartbreaks, and years of scraping by with nothing but faith and flour. Instead, I inhaled slowly through my nose, because old women are always expected to swallow their pain quietly, to nod and smile and pretend their hearts aren't breaking in places too tender to touch. Later, when they all left for the park, I remained behind under the pretense of needing rest, though rest was the last thing I wanted. The silence of the house pressed around me like thick fog. I walked back to the fireplace, knelt despite the strain in my knees, and touched the cooled ash with trembling fingers. A smear of soot clung to my skin, dark and soft like grief itself. I felt foolish and old, a woman kneeling in front of a hearth as though praying to something already dead. But I couldn't stop myself, because some small part of me still hoped to find a corner of unburned paper, a fragment of my mother's looping script, anything that might have resisted the fire. But there was nothing. Nothing except a thin layer of brittle gray and the faint metallic glint of a nail buried beneath it. Standing up took more strength than I expected, and as I steadied myself on the mantel, my hand brushed a framed photograph of my son's family. The perfect, curated portrait they hung for guests to admire. I wasn't in it, of course. I rarely was. They didn't mean offense, they always said. The photographer just wanted immediate family. The frame just happened to fit 4 pictures, not 5. The wall space was limited. Excuses. Excuses that now felt like breadcrumbs leading me toward a truth I had spent years avoiding. They wanted me small, quiet, helpful, present only when useful and invisible when not. When they returned, cheerful and flushed from the fresh air, I was sitting at the table with a cup of tea gone cold. My daughter-in-law looked at me with mild surprise, as though she had forgotten I existed. My son asked whether I wanted to help prepare dinner, and when I said I wasn't feeling well, he exchanged a glance with his wife, a quick flicker of impatience mixed with pity. Not concern, not love. Pity. The kind you give an old stray dog that keeps returning to your porch. And that glance, that tiny shift of the eyes, became the spark that ignited something colder and sharper than anger inside me. It wasn't rage. Rage can be dismissed. It was recognition. Recognition that the hierarchy of that house placed me firmly at the bottom. Recognition that my needs were negotiable, my memories disposable, my presence conditional. Recognition that I had allowed this for so long that they believed it was the natural order of things. Recognition that nothing would ever change unless I changed it. That night, when the house finally settled and the lights dimmed, I lay awake in the guest room with my hands clasped on my chest, staring at the ceiling as though it held answers. My mother had been a quiet woman, but quiet is not the same as weak. She had survived worse than disrespect. She had endured years when kindness was a luxury and hope a rare borrowed currency. Before she died, she gave me the recipe box with a solemnity that unsettled me at the time. "There's more in there than recipes," she said, "and one day you'll understand." Back then I thought she meant wisdom, or comfort, or flavor. I didn't know she meant survival. I didn't know she meant escape. But lying there, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant laughter from my son's bedroom where they watched a show without inviting me, I felt something shift beneath the grief. A quiet, deliberate certainty. The fire was not the end. It was the beginning. A violent clearing, yes, but also a call to move, to act, to reclaim whatever pieces of myself I still possessed. A catalyst that forced me to see the truth I had avoided. I did not belong in that house, not anymore, and maybe not for a very long time. And so, with my heart sore but steady, I made a decision in that dark room, a decision that started with a whisper, built into a promise, and settled into my bones with the weight of something irrevocable. I would not let them erase me. I would not let them dictate which parts of my story were worthy of keeping. I would find whatever my mother left for me, whether it survived the fire or not. And I would decide, for the first time in decades, what my life was allowed to become. I woke before dawn the next morning, not because I had slept well, but because sleep had become a thin sheet stretched over a sharp bed of thoughts that refused to rest. The house was quiet, wrapped in that artificial calm expensive homes wear in the early hours, a hush that feels less like peace and more like suppression. I sat up slowly, letting the cold air touch my skin, and listened to the distant hum of the refrigerator down the hall, the soft clicking of the thermostat adjusting itself, the muted thud of my own pulse in my ears. I felt older than I had the day before, as though grief had added another decade to my bones overnight. And yet I also felt something new, a strange and steady alertness beneath the fatigue, like the first tremor in the body right before a person stands up after kneeling too long. I went to the bathroom, splashed water on my face, and stared at my reflection in the mirror. The glass held a woman who looked tired but not defeated, a woman who had lived through too much to crumble simply because those she loved had forgotten how to treat her like someone worth respecting. Behind me, the guest room looked small and still. The edges of the room softened by the pale morning light, and as I took a breath, I felt a faint spark of defiance in my chest, almost like warmth trying to push through a layer of frost. I made my way downstairs, intending only to make tea, hoping the quiet routine might steady my nerves. But the moment I reached the kitchen, I stopped. Everything felt different, subtly rearranged in that way people alter a room when they think no one will notice. The dish towels had been moved, the fruit bowl was missing, and the countertop had been wiped with a disinfectant that smelled aggressively of citrus and eucalyptus. There was a new jar on the island, a sleek glass cylinder filled with carefully folded cloth napkins. My daughter-in-law believed in fresh starts, which in her language usually meant erasing something that had belonged to me. I walked slowly across the kitchen, brushing my fingertips over the cool marble. And then I saw it. An empty space on the open shelf beneath the window where I used to keep the 2 little ceramic birds my mother had given me decades ago. The ones she found at a flea market when I was newly married and afraid of everything. They weren't valuable, not to anyone else, but they were a reminder of her humor and hope. Now the space was bare, wiped clean. I opened the cabinet under the sink on instinct, and there they were. My ceramic birds tossed carelessly into a plastic bin with half-used sponges, a bottle of bleach, and an old scrub brush. One of them, the smaller of the 2, had a crack running down its beak. I stood there, holding it in my palm, feeling anger rise slowly, almost calmly, the way cold water climbs upward in fabric. It wasn't the kind of hot rage people shout with. It was a quiet, tightening anger, the kind that settles deep and makes everything around you suddenly, unmistakably clear. They had burned my mother's recipes the day before. Today they had demoted her birds to the trash. Tomorrow, I realized, they would find something else. Another piece of my history to discard, another memory to smother beneath their idea of order and modernity. I set the cracked bird gently back in the bin, because the gesture of picking it up had already told me everything I needed. I closed the cabinet softly, stood up straight, and did something I hadn't done in years. I walked into the living room and put on my coat with silent purpose. My son came down the stairs right as I was tying the scarf around my neck. His voice was surprised, tinged with mild irritation masked as concern. "Where are you going this early?" he asked, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "For a walk," I replied calmly, without offering the kind of eager explanation he had grown accustomed to. He frowned slightly, the way people frown when something deviates from the script they've written for you. "Do you want me to come with you?" he offered. Not because he wanted to, but because asking made him feel virtuous. I shook my head. No, I just need air. He lingered on the last stair, uncertain, waiting to see whether I would soften, whether I would offer him reassurance, whether I would return to my usual habit of making him comfortable, even when I was bleeding inside. But I didn't. I opened the door and stepped out before he could say anything else. The cold morning wind brushed against my face like a truth I had been avoiding. The neighborhood was still asleep, its manicured hedges and symmetrical lawns giving off the strange neutrality of wealth. I walked slowly at first, letting my legs remember the rhythm they had neglected. And for a while, I just listened to the softness of the world waking up. A dog barked 2 streets over. A sprinkler sputtered. A newspaper thunked onto someone's driveway. It all felt distant, muted behind the fog of betrayal I carried like an invisible shawl around my shoulders. I didn't know where I was going. I only knew I needed to go somewhere, anywhere that wasn't the house where my belongings were being treated like trash. I ended up at the small community park at the edge of the neighborhood, a place I had passed before but never entered. Its wooden benches were damp with dew, and the swing set creaked in the breeze. I sat down on one of the benches and stared at the empty playground, remembering the afternoons when I used to take my son to a park so similar to this one. A park where the sand stuck to his shoes and he laughed at nothing and everything. Where I felt needed and seen and alive. Sitting there now, decades later, I wondered at what point my usefulness had replaced my identity. At what point I had become a woman they consulted only when it suited them. At what point love had flattened into obligation. I watched the light shift through the branches above me and felt a bitter clarity in my chest. They didn't want my history because they didn't want the parts of me that didn't fit their version of who I was supposed to be. After a long while, I stood and began walking again. But this time, I chose a direction that wasn't familiar, a street I hadn't taken before. The houses grew older as I moved farther away from the manicured core of the neighborhood. Paint chipped, lawns grew imperfect, mailboxes leaned slightly to one side. And somehow the imperfection soothed me. It reminded me of the town I grew up in, where nothing matched and everything was shaped by the hands of people who had lived real lives, messy, complicated, earnest lives. When I reached a small street with uneven pavement and ivy crawling up a fence, something caught my eye. An old brick house with a sagging porch and a faded sign in the yard that read, "Estate Sale Today." My heart lurched strangely. My mother had loved estate sales. She always said that objects carried stories, that belonging to someone else first didn't diminish value, it deepened it. I followed the pull I felt in my chest and walked inside. The house smelled of dust and lemon oil. Tables were lined with knickknacks and photographs and stacks of books whose spines had softened with years. I moved slowly from room to room, touching nothing but absorbing everything, feeling the strange intimacy of seeing remnants of someone else's life laid gently out for strangers to browse. And then, in a small upstairs bedroom, I saw it. A wooden box, nearly identical to the one my daughter-in-law had burned. Same size, same shape, even the same small brass latch. My breath caught. I walked toward it, drawn as if by a thread tied around my ribs. Up close, I realized it wasn't identical. The carvings were slightly different, the varnish darker, the wood heavier. But still, there it was. The shape my mother had chosen to hold her recipes, her stories, her handwriting. I reached out and ran my fingers along the lid. The wood was cool and smooth beneath my skin, and something inside me trembled. Something that felt like recognition or longing or the echo of a life I thought I had lost forever. A woman sorting items near the dresser looked up. "Lovely piece, isn't it?" she said gently. "Belonged to the owner's mother. She used to keep sewing patterns in it." I nodded without trusting my voice. The woman smiled with a familiarity that felt unexpected and soft. "Funny how things survive," she added, "even when people don't mean them to." I felt those words settle deep in me like seeds finding soil, and I whispered, almost to myself, "Yes, funny how they do." I didn't buy the box. I didn't need to. But standing there in that quiet bedroom, with the early sun filtering through the lace curtains, I understood something important. The fire had not erased what mattered. What mattered was carried inside me, stubborn and alive, waiting for me to stop trying to fit into places that couldn't hold me. I walked home slowly, breathing deeper than I had in months. The house would still be cold when I walked inside. My daughter-in-law would still be efficient and dismissive. My son would still be tethered to his curated life. Nothing outside would have changed. But something inside had shifted. Something had awakened. The quiet erasure they practiced so skillfully had begun to falter, because I had seen what survived. And as I stepped back onto their pristine porch with my cracked ceramic bird still waiting under the sink, I felt the tremor of a realization settle fully into place. They could burn the box. They could chip the birds. They could rearrange the kitchen until it erased every trace of me, but they could not stop the truth from rising, and they could not stop what that truth was about to set in motion. I didn't go back to the estate sale house the next day, though the image of that wooden box lingered behind my eyes, like an aftertaste of something sweet and painful. Instead, I drifted through the morning like a woman walking through a room filled with smoke, seeing in outlines rather than details, my mind circling the same quiet truth. If a near duplicate of my mother's box had survived decades in a stranger's attic, then the universe was telling me something about the things we believe are gone, urging me to look closer, to stop letting grief dictate where my eyes fell. My daughter-in-law noticed my silence and interpreted it, as always, in the least generous way possible. She made a point of narrating every movement as she reorganized drawers and cabinets, a pointed performance of competence meant to remind me that the house was hers to command. My son watched from a distance, torn between irritation and discomfort, though he said nothing until he saw me wrap my scarf around my neck just before noon. "Going out again?" he asked, the question carrying the implication of suspicion rather than care, as though a woman my age existed only within the boundaries other people set for her. I told him I needed fresh air, and he nodded stiffly, then added, "Just let us know if you'll be gone long. It worries Carla when you wander." Wander. As though I were some absent-minded relic liable to lose myself between one street and the next, rather than a fully conscious woman walking away because the house no longer felt like a place I was permitted to breathe. The sky was heavy with clouds, but the air felt clearer than it had the day before, and as I walked down the long tree-lined street, I felt something settle in me. Something like resolve. I wasn't looking for a destination. I was letting my feet move until the fog inside my chest loosened its grip. I turned onto a quieter road, one lined with older houses that hadn't been stripped of their history, and found myself slowing as I reached a small home with faded blue shutters and a cracked pathway. Someone, an older woman from the look of the garden, had left a metal watering can next to a row of potted herbs. The scent of rosemary drifted toward me, and for a moment I felt my mother beside me, showing me how to press the leaves between my fingers to release their oil. I stood there, caught in the memory, until I realized a figure was moving inside the house. A woman in her 80s, perhaps even close to my age, was adjusting a stack of books on a table near the window. She didn't notice me, but her movements had a kind of grounded certainty I hadn't felt in myself in a long time. And seeing her, simply existing in her space, with a sense of ownership and peace, made something deep within me ache, not with jealousy, but with recognition of what I had lost by letting other people dictate the terms of my belonging. I walked on, turning toward the edge of the neighborhood where a thin wooded trail wound through a patch of city-preserved land. I hadn't intended to follow it, but my feet found the path naturally, and soon the sounds of traffic and manicured life faded behind me, replaced by the soft hiss of wind through leaves and the distant call of a bird. The trail reminded me of walks I used to take in my younger years, when I thought solitude was a gift rather than an accusation. Back then, I walked because I wanted to dream. Now I walked because I needed to remember who I was before my world narrowed into a single guest room and a handful of polite, dismissive smiles. Halfway down the trail, I stopped at a break in the trees where a fallen log created a rough bench. I brushed off the bark and sat, letting the weight of the last few days settle into me. I reached into my coat pocket for a tissue and instead felt the sharp corner of something metallic digging into my fingertips. When I pulled it out, my breath caught. It was the charred, blackened key I had dug from the ashes the previous afternoon, the one I had assumed was nothing more than a ruined scrap of metal. Yet here it was, heavier than I remembered, solid, stubborn, bearing the marks of fire but not defeated by it. I held it tightly, turning it over in my hand, feeling the ridges and grooves still intact beneath the soot. My mother had taped it to the bottom of her recipe box, hidden it with deliberate intention, and I had dismissed it as sentimental clutter, assuming she was holding on to some memento of a past I didn't fully understand. Only now, sitting in the woods with the metallic smell of soot lingering on my fingers, did I feel the truth press against me with undeniable force. That key was not symbolic. It was not a trinket. It was for something. A thought surfaced. An old address I hadn't thought about in years, written in my mother's handwriting on the back of a faded postcard she kept tucked between the dessert cards in the box. I had come across it countless times, always assuming it was a keepsake from a forgotten road trip or a relative's home she intended to visit someday. I'd never asked. She never explained. But now that address tugged at my memory with a strange urgency, as though the fire had burned away the fog surrounding its significance. I whispered it aloud, half expecting the sound to pull my mother's voice back through time. A cottage near the old harbor district, a place she once described as a door I never had the courage to open. And the key, this key, was taped to the box from the very beginning. A gust of wind swept through the clearing, scattering brittle leaves across my feet. And in that moment, I understood that the path ahead of me was no longer about a burned box or a dismissive daughter-in-law. It was about my mother, about the woman she had been, and the secrets she had tried to entrust to me before her voice grew thin and her hands too tired to fold letters. She had wanted me to follow something, to find something, and I had spent decades too busy surviving to listen. I rose from the log with a steadiness that surprised me. My knees ached, yes, but the pain felt purposeful. I walked out of the woods and followed the long road back toward my son's house. not because I intended to stay, but because I needed to gather what little belonged to me before I left for wherever that key intended to take me. When I stepped onto the porch, I heard voices inside, my son speaking low, my daughter-in-law responding with that clipped tone she reserved for anything she considered a nuisance. My name floated between their sentences like a heavy thread. At any other time, I might have stopped, hesitated, waited until it was safe to enter with a smile that smoothed over their tension. But not now. Now I pushed the door open and walked in without waiting for a pause in their conversation. They both looked at me with surprise that quickly curdled into defensiveness. "Everything okay, Mom?" my son asked, as though reading from a script meant to appear caring while avoiding any actual emotion. I didn't answer immediately. I stepped into the room, removed my coat carefully, and hung it on the hook, letting the silence stretch just long enough for both of them to feel it. My daughter-in-law cleared her throat, shifting uncomfortably. She hated pauses she couldn't control. "We were just talking about planning the weekend," she said. "It'll be easier if we know your schedule." "My schedule," I repeated softly, feeling the weight of the key against my palm inside my pocket, "is about to change." They exchanged a quick glance, the kind that communicates more than words ever could, concern mixed with irritation, confusion tinged with disbelief. They didn't know what I meant. Not yet. But I knew. And for the first time in a very long time, the knowing belonged entirely to me. Everything after that moment, their reactions, their questions, their attempts to steer the conversation back into familiar, manageable territory, faded into the background, because the shift had already happened. Not in the house, and not in them, but in me. The fire had taken something precious, but it had also uncovered something far more powerful: a direction, a purpose, a truth waiting patiently in the ashes until I was ready to see it. I went to my room, closed the door gently, and reached for the small suitcase I had brought with me months earlier. As I unzipped it, the faint scent of lavender sachets my mother used to make drifted upward, and with it came the steady pulse of realization. I had not come this far in life just to fade into someone else's convenience. The key was warm in my hand now, almost alive, and I felt a certainty bloom in my chest. Quiet, but unstoppable. Something was calling me, and for once, I was going to answer. When I finally reached the quiet certainty that I had to leave, that the key in my pocket was no longer a curious remnant, but a command issued from a woman who had loved me long before I ever learned to love myself. The world inside my son's house began to shift in small, unsettling ways, as though the walls themselves sensed my impending departure and tried, in their sterile and curated way, to hold me still. I noticed it almost immediately, the slight tightening in my daughter-in-law's voice whenever I so much as touched the drawer handles, the way my son watched me when I walked into the living room. A look not of affection, but of quiet evaluation, like someone gauging the stability of an object he plans to store in a basement. There was a moment that week when I found myself standing near the pantry, holding a jar of lentils I'd bought for a soup recipe my mother once whispered into my hands, and I heard Carla speaking in that low, brittle voice she used for anything she found inconvenient. She was talking to my son in the next room, unaware that I could hear her through the sliding door. "She's getting unpredictable," she said, "slipping out of the house without telling us, wandering around like she's lost. It's too much. We need to think about what comes next." My son murmured something in response, something evasive. But beneath it, I heard agreement, and that small, quiet consensus crept under my ribs like a chill. I put the jar of lentils down carefully, as though setting down something fragile, and for a moment I simply stood there, feeling the air thicken around me. It wasn't fear. Fear is sharp, quick, almost energetic. This was something heavier, the recognition that people you trust can reshape the narrative of your life in ways that make you a character rather than a participant, a concern rather than a person. I walked out onto the back patio and let the cold air strike my face because I needed something real against my skin to push back against their version of me, the one they were building in whispers and sideways glances. I gripped the railing with both hands, staring at the perfectly trimmed hedges, and felt a deep rumble inside me that was part grief, part awakening. If they already believed I was slipping, disappearing into fog, what would stop them from taking steps to make that narrative true? What would stop them from deciding that my independence was dangerous, that my memories were unreliable, that my very sense of self was a liability? Days passed in a haze of avoidant politeness. My daughter-in-law became overly helpful, asking if I needed reminders for my medication, though I had never missed a dose in my life. She labeled shelves as though organizing a child's playroom, smiling brightly as she informed me where the cups and plates now belonged. My son began sending me links to articles about transitioning to assisted living, framed as harmless suggestions, crumbs left on a trail he hoped I would follow. He didn't know I had already chosen a path of my own. They hovered closer, watched more carefully, spoke more slowly as if speaking to someone whose comprehension had become fragile, and each gesture, though wrapped in superficial kindness, tightened around me like a net. One afternoon, as I folded a sweater in the guest room, I heard the soft click of the doorknob turning, and before I could respond, my daughter-in-law stepped inside with the sort of apologetic smile people use when they are about to violate a boundary they never respected to begin with. "Just checking on you," she said, scanning the room with thinly concealed scrutiny, her eyes landing on the partially packed suitcase at the foot of the bed. "Planning a little trip?" she asked, though her tone made it clear she wanted a different truth, something like confusion or forgetfulness, something she could point to later as evidence. I closed the drawer slowly and turned to her. "Yes," I said, meeting her eyes without hesitation. "A very old trip." She didn't understand, but she felt the resistance and discomfort flickered across her face. My son confronted me later that evening, his voice tight with concern that wasn't entirely genuine. "Mom, Carla said you're packing. Are you upset? Did something happen?" I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of the question, but instead I sat down in the armchair and folded my hands in my lap. "Something happened a long time ago," I said. "And something happened yesterday, and something has been happening every day since I arrived." He frowned, the kind of frown that says he is listening only to formulate a rebuttal. "If this is about the recipe box," he began, but I raised my hand to stop him. "It was never just about the box," I said. "The box was the moment you showed me who you have become when you think I won't challenge you." He looked wounded, but beneath it there was irritation, the kind that rises in people who dislike being reminded that others are not as malleable as they believed. The next escalation came unexpectedly, not with raised voices or dramatic declarations, but with a quiet envelope placed neatly at my place at the dinner table. The moment I saw my name typed on the front, I felt a wave of dread move through me, cold and firm. They watched me as I opened it, Inside was a pamphlet for a residential care facility, one of those glossy brochures with pictures of silver-haired seniors laughing over board games and walking in manicured gardens. My daughter-in-law launched into an explanation before I even breathed. "We're just thinking ahead," she said brightly. "You know, options, just in case. We want you to be safe." The word safe hit me like a blow. Safe according to whom? Safe from what? Safe or silent? Safe or controlled? I slid the pamphlet back into the envelope and pushed it toward her. "You should keep this," I said softly. "You may need it before I do." My son bristled at that, his face tightening into an expression that reminded me eerily of his father when backed into a corner, when empathy gave way to defensiveness. "Mom," he said with strained patience, "we're trying to help." I stared at him for a long moment, then said quietly, "You're trying to manage me." The distinction hung in the air like smoke, and he didn't deny it. He merely sighed and looked away. The next morning I found my suitcase moved, not far, only from the foot of the bed to the closet, but the gesture was unmistakable. A soft attempt to nudge me back into compliance, an unspoken message that all decisions about my autonomy were subject to review. I stood in the center of the room and felt something shift beneath my ribs, something that crackled like a spark finding dry tinder. I walked to the closet, pulled the suitcase out, and zipped it firmly. Then I took out the key from my pocket and held it in my palm. The soot smudged my skin, but the metal felt reassuringly solid, and I knew with absolute certainty that whatever waited behind the door this key belonged to was more mine than anything in this house had been for years. But the universe is rarely content with subtlety. It prefers to test resolve. That afternoon, as I sat in the kitchen drinking tea that tasted faintly metallic from the pot Carla never rinsed properly, the doorbell rang. My son answered it, and when his voice dropped into the low register he used for strangers in suits, I felt a ripple of foreboding. A few moments later, he returned with a man in neatly pressed slacks and a polite, professional smile. "Mom," my son said carefully, "this is Mr. Grant. He's here to talk to us about long-term planning and resources for aging." The phrasing was so delicate, so sanitized, it made something ancient inside me recoil. The man extended his hand, but I didn't take it. Instead, I stood slowly, letting the silence stretch in a way that made him drop his gaze. "I didn't ask for this meeting," I said, my voice steady, "and I won't be part of it." My son took a step toward me, hands half raised as though soothing a startled animal. "Mom, please, let's just hear him out." But the room had already shifted. I could feel it, the moment when something inside you reaches its breaking point not with noise, but with clarity. I looked at the man, then at my son and his wife, and realized they had orchestrated this behind closed doors, building a narrative in which I was a problem to be solved, not a person with agency. I left the room without another word. Behind me I heard murmurs, hushed discussion, the careful tone of people trying not to escalate a situation they inadvertently created. But I didn't slow down. I went upstairs, closed the door to my room, and locked it for the first time since moving in. The click of the lock felt like the soft closing of a long-buried chapter. I packed the last of my things, folded the clothes that still carried faint traces of my own life, and tucked the charred key into the small inner pocket of my coat. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and waited. Not for courage, but for the house to settle into its evening rhythm. for the moment when they stopped checking on me, for the familiar hum of the dishwasher and the muffled conversation in the living room. That meant they had returned to believing I was quietly complying. When the house finally went still, I rose, pulled my coat tight, opened the window, and climbed out slowly into the cold evening air. My knees protested, but I kept moving, gripping the drain pipe for balance until my feet found the ground. I walked across the backyard without looking back, my suitcase rolling softly behind me on the grass, and for the first time in months, perhaps years, I felt the full stretch of my own life opening ahead of me like an unmarked road. The key in my pocket pressed against my thigh with each step, a small, steady weight that promised not answers, but possibility. And possibility, after all I had endured, was more than enough. The wind picked up as I reached the end of the street, cool and bracing, carrying with it the faint scent of the sea, as though the place my mother had wanted me to find was already whispering its distance into the night. I didn't know exactly where I was going, and yet I had never felt more certain of my direction. The escalation was not theirs anymore. It was mine. And I was finally moving. I reached the harbor district late in the morning after traveling through towns that felt both familiar and foreign, the landscapes shifting slowly from polished suburban quiet to the worn edges of old neighborhoods that had given up trying to disguise their age. The closer I drew to the address written in my mother's handwriting, the more the world around me seemed to soften and then sharpen, as though the air itself were adjusting to hold whatever truth waited behind the door I had carried a key to for more than half my life without realizing it. The street was narrow, lined with cottages that sagged slightly toward the sea, their paint peeling in thin curls that trembled in the wind. I walked slowly, almost cautiously, because part of me feared that the address would lead to nothing, that the fire and the ash and the key would all culminate in a door that opened onto emptiness. Yet another part of me, the stubborn part inherited from the woman who raised me, believed that the truth was rarely hollow, even when painful. When I finally found the cottage, small, salt-worn, its shutters faded to a muted blue that once must have been bright, I stopped at the gate and let my hand rest on the latch. The cottage looked abandoned, but not forgotten, the kind of place life had stepped away from, but time had not managed to erase. My mother had walked here once. She had stood where I stood. She had written that address on a card and hidden the key for me because she knew, in a way I failed to see, that someday I would need a place untouched by the hands of those who would diminish me. I opened the gate and walked up the narrow path, each step heavier with memory than the last, until I reached the door. The lock was old brass, dark with age but intact. My heart beat with a strange, fierce rhythm as I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the charred key, its edges still carrying the faint scent of smoke. I slid it into the lock, heard the scrape of metal against metal, and for a moment I closed my eyes. When I turned it, the click resonated through me like a pulse. The door groaned as it opened, releasing a stale draft scented with dust and salt. I stepped inside, blinking as my eyes adjusted to the dim interior. Light filtered through cracked blinds, revealing a small room with wooden floors and a narrow table pushed against the wall. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, yet nothing felt derelict. The space felt paused, held still by intention rather than abandonment. I took a few steps deeper and then stopped, because on the table sat an object that made my breath hitch in my throat. A wooden chest, larger than my mother's recipe box, but carved from the same type of oak, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. The sight of it felt like a hand closing gently around mine. I approached it slowly, afraid that moving too quickly would shatter the moment. The latch was tarnished but functional, and when I lifted it, the lid rose with surprising ease. Inside lay stacks of envelopes bound with twine, each one bearing my mother's handwriting, her looping cursive steady even in the letters written late in her life. Beneath them were notebooks, thin, fragile, their pages filled with recipes, stories, and dates, but also something more unexpected. Long, detailed letters addressed to me but never delivered. Confessions written in ink, too heartfelt to speak aloud. I ran my hand across the top stack, feeling the grooves where her pen had pressed into the paper. As I lifted the first envelope, a small photograph slipped out. It was of my mother, standing beside this very cottage, her hair windblown, her expression neither sad nor joyful, but resolved. On the back, she had written, "For when you need a home inside yourself again." My breath quivered as I read the words again and again. My mother had known what I would face, had known that the people I trusted might fail to hold me gently, had known that one day I would need a place untouched by revision, untouched by dismissal. She had kept this house for me, or perhaps for the version of me she believed I could become when freed from the expectations that had shaped my adulthood. I sat down at the small table and opened one of the letters. My mother's voice rose from the page slowly, as though awakening after a long sleep. She wrote about her regrets, her hopes for me, her fear that I had inherited her talent for silence at the expense of her stubbornness, her belief that one day I would need to reclaim something she herself had lost. As I read, tears slid down my cheeks silently, not because the words were sad, but because they were true, in a way only a mother's words could be. She knew I would be diminished by people who claimed to love me. She knew I would be asked to surrender parts of myself to keep the peace. She knew I would forget to choose myself. And so she left me this. Her handwriting, her voice, her history, her defiance preserved in a chest only I could open. I read until my vision blurred, then rested my palms flat on the table as though steadying myself against a tide. The cottage was still, but not silent. It felt alive with the presence of someone who had loved me beyond her own life. I stood slowly and walked into the kitchen. The counters were worn but sturdy. The cabinets held mismatched cups. The window above the sink overlooked the sea. In the corner, on a small wooden shelf, sat a tin box labeled with my mother's initials. I opened it and found a folded deed. My mother had owned this cottage outright. And beneath the deed, tucked carefully inside a faded envelope, was a note dated 6 months before she died. "You will know when to come." The realization that she had prepared all of this for me, not as an inheritance of wealth, but as an inheritance of self, broke something open inside my chest. I walked back to the table, gathered the letters into my arms, and held them close. I had never expected rescue at this age. I had never expected possibility. And yet here it was, in a cottage by the sea, in the ink of a woman who understood more about my future than I ever allowed myself to imagine. I stepped outside a few minutes later and looked at the ocean, its surface shifting under the pale light of afternoon, and for the first time in years I felt the ground under my feet belonged to me. I had not just unlocked a cottage. I had unlocked a truth, that I was capable of stepping out of the narratives others wrote for me, capable of choosing a path untouched by control or judgment. My mother had given me a place where my name was not an afterthought, where my memories were not clutter, where my presence did not need justification. Standing there, with the wind lifting the hair around my face and the sea murmuring like an old friend, I felt something settle inside me, with the weight of a decision that could not be undone. I would stay. I would claim what she left me. I would build a life that told the truth about who I was, who I had been, and who I was becoming. And in that realization, the world, not the one behind me, but the one before me, finally opened. The days that followed did not turn into some miraculous second youth. No choirs of angels descended. No newspapers wrote about the old woman who finally stepped through a door meant for her. Life simply began to move in a different rhythm, quieter and steadier, like a heartbeat that had been irregular for years and was only now finding its natural tempo. And it suited me more than any of the polished comforts I had left behind. I cleaned the cottage slowly, not with the frantic energy of someone trying to erase the past, but with the tenderness of a woman finally allowed to touch her own story without apology. Each ragged curtain I washed, each dish I rinsed, each floorboard I swept seemed to whisper that I had earned this place with every year I spent giving more than I kept. I stacked my mother's letters in neat piles on the table, reading one or two each evening instead of devouring them all at once, because they felt less like a cache of secrets and more like conversations we were finally having, without interruption. And I wanted to hear her voice stretch across time in manageable, savored portions. Outside, the sea breathed in and out below the cottage, sometimes calm, sometimes agitated, and I understood its moods in a way I never understood, the unpredictable weather inside my son's house. Here, when the wind rose, it did not pretend to be. Gentle, and when the sun broke through, it did not apologize for brightness. Everything was what it was, nothing disguised. I found a small market a short walk away, where the woman behind the counter started calling me dear after the second visit. Not because she needed favors or endless babysitting or down payments, but because that was simply how she spoke to people whose faces she recognized. She asked where I was staying, and when I pointed up the road, she nodded with the easy acceptance of someone who doesn't need your entire biography to believe you belong. Sometimes, in the evenings, I made the recipes from my mother's notebooks, not following them exactly. She never did either, but letting the measurements and notes and little comments in the margins guide my hands. The cottage filled with the smells of cinnamon, onions, lemon zest, toasted garlic, and each dish felt like a small act of defiance against the word garbage that had been thrown at my history like a stone. It didn't take long for my son to discover that I was gone. I knew the moment would come without needing a clock. The first letter arrived within a week, forwarded from my old address through a trail of paperwork I had quietly updated before leaving. It was thick, written in his careful, practiced handwriting, a performance even on paper. He wrote about worry, about responsibility, about how leaving without a conversation had put them in a difficult position with neighbors and the professional man they had dragged into our private fracture. He mentioned the fire only once, calling it an unfortunate misunderstanding, as if my mother's box had thrown itself into the flames while everyone's back was turned. He asked me to come back to talk like adults, a phrase that might have amused me if it didn't sting so much, because adulthood, as I had lived it, was mostly about swallowing words so other people could remain comfortable. I did not respond immediately, not because I wanted to punish him, but because answering from a place of fresh hurt felt like handing him the same smoke that had choked me for months, and I was tired of breathing through other people's scripts. Instead, I wrote a different letter, a shorter one, to the only person in that house who had ever looked at me without weighing my usefulness, my grandson. I told him I was safe, that the stories he loved to hear are still in my head and on paper, that if he ever wanted to visit, the sea would be waiting, and so would I. But that this visit would be on my terms, not as someone's unpaid babysitter in an overlit kitchen, and that he should only come when he was old enough to understand that choosing yourself is not abandonment, it is survival. I included the address of the cottage and a line from one of my mother's letters. Sometimes the bravest thing a woman can do is walk through a door no one else believes she has the right to open. Eventually, I did write back to my son. Not a long, pleading letter, not an angry manifesto, just a clear piece of truth laid flat on paper so there could be no confusion. I told him that I would not be returning to a home where my presence was conditional on my silence, that I would not live in a place where my mother's handwriting could be burned and then written off as clutter, that I would not sign any documents or discuss any long-term planning with men in suits who saw my age as an opportunity to move numbers around. I told him I loved him, because love does not vanish even when respect has been misplaced. But I also told him that love without respect is a kind of slow suffocation, and I had already spent more than enough years holding my breath. I did not ask for forgiveness, and I did not offer it, because what we had between us wasn't a single sin to be pardoned. It was a long, tangled history that would either grow or wither, depending on whether he ever learned to see me as a person instead of a role. His response, when it came, was shorter, sharper, wounded in the way of men who have never examined the quiet harm they inflict. He spoke of duty, of embarrassment, of how difficult it was to explain to others that his mother had run off at her age. The phrase stung, but also made me smile grimly, because if disappearing into a life I chose for myself was running off, then I supposed I had always been more capable of escape than any of us realized. I put his letter with the others in a drawer, not in the chest with my mother's words, because her honesty and his defensiveness did not belong side by side. They were different species of ink. Time did what it always does when you stop asking it to behave differently. It passed. I found a rhythm in the cottage, mornings with strong coffee and one of my mother's letters, afternoons walking along the rocky shore with a scarf pulled tight around my neck, evenings cooking for myself without anyone asking what I was making or why. I was taking up counter space. I learned which floorboards complained the loudest, which window stuck in the rain, which corner of the porch caught the last slant of sunlight. Sometimes loneliness came and sat with me, a familiar, heavy guest. But it never stayed as long as it used to, because now it had to share the room with something else, something I hadn't felt in years. A sense of being in my own life rather than on its outskirts. One night, as the wind rattled the shutters and the lamplight pooled soft and yellow on the table, I took out a plain sheet of paper and wrote a letter I did not intend to send to anyone but the woman I once was. I told her I was sorry it took so long to stop explaining away the cuts and the burns, that I was sorry I had let people call her memories clutter and her needs excessive, that I was proud of her for finally stepping away from the fireplace and following the heat back to the source of her own warmth. I ended it with a sentence that surprised me as it flowed from the pen. You were never old garbage. You were the box, the recipes, the key, and the hand that taped it there. I folded the letter and slipped it into one of my mother's notebooks, closing the cover gently as if sealing a small, private ceremony. I suppose that is what this life has become now, a series of small ceremonies that no one applauds, no one photographs, no one posts about, but which matter more than any birthday party I ever organized for people who arrived late and left with full plates and empty thanks. Turning on the porch light when the sky begins to bruise with evening. Choosing a recipe because it reminds me of the way my mother hummed when she stirred a pot. Putting on lipstick before going to the market, not because anyone is watching, but because I enjoy the flash of color when I walk past the window. Standing at the door of the cottage some mornings and saying out loud, "This is mine," just to hear the walls agree. If there is anything to say to another woman who might one day find herself watching a part of her life burn in someone else's fireplace, it is this. The moment they decide your history is worthless is not the moment your story ends. It is the moment a different story offers itself to you, one where you are allowed to be more than what you provide for others, one where you are permitted to follow the small, stubborn keys you have been carrying for years without knowing, one where you walk through a door that opens only because your hand, and no one else's, turned the lock.